Well, you'd think by now we'd know everything there was to know about World War II, but the conflict and its costs were unbelievably massive, and even today there are things about it that just don't make sense. Look, much of the blame for Germany's loss is assigned to Adolf Hitler. Even previously loyal Nazi generals later said their country's weapons program was hindered by Hitler's reluctance and cost Germany the war. But let's not get this twisted. While there's no way whatsoever we're going to defend that Austrian painter, Hitler didn't lose the war all by himself. In fact, just a quick look at the state of affairs at the end of World War II makes this assumption all the more nonsensical. Just consider the source. Many of the reports blaming Hitler for Germany's losses come from Nazi generals and other officers, all of whom were looking for a convenient scapegoat in the aftermath of the war. Hitler did make high-level decisions during the conflict, but he didn't necessarily get into the nitty-gritty of logistics or troop supplies, much less issues like shortages of food, oil, steel, and the like. Those shortages resulted in increasing anxiety over resources that may even have been what pushed Nazi forces to attempt a takeover of Soviet territory, which quickly turned into a resource-consuming disaster. That attempt, known as Operation Barbarossa, along with Germany's broader failures, can't possibly all have been the fault of a single man. Hitler was clearly powerful and obviously terrible, but he was working within a system that included many other powerful and similarly terrible players. So all the Nazis stunk. In 1940, Winston Churchill was appointed prime minister by King George VI, and most accounts of his performance in the job during the war depict him as a heroic Allied leader who was key to saving the world from fascism.
Churchill got a lot wrong, but if you're going to get one thing right, the Second World War is pretty high up there.
Churchill certainly deserves a massive amount of credit for leading Britain through the dark days of the war, but the reality is a little more complex due to one tiny little factor: money. Churchill wasn't always hard at work rallying a nation against the Axis powers. In fact, in his pre-war days as a politician, he advocated for a policy that put Britain in serious danger. That policy, which dates back to 1919, is now known as the 10-Year Rule. It directed military officials to plan the next decade under the assumption that Britain would refrain from entering into any major war in the meantime. What that means was the nation's treasury had some control over the defense budget, though historians have argued that the effect of that rule has been exaggerated. But there's still a case to be made that this policy hampered defense, and Churchill certainly had a role to play here, as he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer from late 1924 to 1929. But in his defense, Churchill had few easy answers. When he told the House of Commons in June 1930, "I believe that wars are over for our day," could he have really predicted another bloody global conflict? Just a few years later, Churchill recognized the changing tide and loudly argued for the British to begin building up their defenses.
Our greatest days, they lie ahead. Sieg Heil.
These days, the idea of American support of Nazi Germany sounds confusing, if not downright horrifying. At least we hope so. But back in the 1930s and 40s, more than a few Americans were sympathetic to the Nazi cause. Consider the 1939 Nazi rally held in New York City's Madison Square Garden, which brought in crowds of more than 20,000. It was sponsored by the German-American Bund, an organization that didn't just hold rallies, but also distributed propaganda, organized youth camps, and more in the effort to promote its unlikely combo of US patriotism and Nazi ideology. Why would anyone buy that, even back then? Well, part of the answer is connected to the rise of white supremacist hate groups in the US. Members of those organizations were attracted to the notions of racial and social purity that were key to the German ideology of the time.
Superior races must battle inferior races or be corrupted by them.
There's another layer to that often gets overlooked: the economy. If you didn't pay any attention to the silly mustaches and straight arm salutes, the German economy was looking a whole lot better than the Depression-era US economy. The GDP was on the rise, wages were up, so to an outside, unprying eye, things looked pretty good. There were also Americans of German descent who, though they may have been a generation or more removed from living in Europe, were reluctant to levy criticism against their homeland, especially in light of waves of discrimination against German immigrants after World War I. For many, one of the most chilling conundrums of the Second World War is how so many Germans and other Europeans managed to turn a blind eye to the Holocaust. With 6 million Jewish people victims of the genocide, along with millions more non-Jewish people also killed, the construction of massive concentration camps, and the transport of all those victims on railroad lines that ran throughout Germany, Poland, and more, How could anyone fool themselves into thinking that nothing was happening? It seems impossible, but some Germans indulge themselves in the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, in which the non-Nazi German military somehow didn't know about or participate in the Holocaust or other war crimes. Of course, there's plenty of demonstrable evidence that Wehrmacht personnel knew all about it. When it comes to the Holocaust, the picture that emerges shows that at least some soldiers expressed their displeasure with the genocide, but they had to have known about it to feel any sort of way about it. Wehrmacht commander Johannes Blaskowitz was recorded complaining about the SS-led killing of 10,000 Jewish and Polish people in early 1940. As for other war crimes, Wehrmacht soldiers openly admitted to the widespread killing of combatants and civilians, both closer to home and in Soviet territory. The plight to foreign combatants was especially brutal when it came to the mistreatment of Soviet prisoners of war, with conditions so awful that an estimated 2 million POWs died in German custody over just 8 months. Speaking of, in case you're wondering where that whole 6 million Jews number came from, that would be from the Nazis themselves. Adolf Eichmann himself put that number around 6 million, so let's just stop that whole conversation from popping up in the comments, okay? For at least some Allied strategists and scientists, the specter of a Nazi weapons program was frightening. After all, a German bombing campaign, the Blitz, had torn apart London and other British cities from September 1940 to May 1941, even bombing Buckingham Palace multiple times.
When the Blitz started, London had 57 consecutive nights of bombing.
There were reports of the V-2 missile, the product of a seemingly superpowered ballistics program that, if it had gotten started earlier, might have turned the tide of war in Germany's favor. Except, no. By the 1940s, there was a lot of anxiety among the Allies about what appeared to be a rapidly growing Nazi war machine. Allied bombing raids routinely hit weapons depots and production sites where new jet propulsion technology was used to power missiles. And the arrival of the long-range V-1 rockets in June 1944 and the V-2 in September that year made things seem all the more dire. But were Nazi rocket scientists and pilots really that successful? Despite their fearsome reputation, the missiles often missed the mark and fell out of the sky. Others misfired over unpopulated areas, which may have annoyed Nazi officials left holding hefty expense reports for the V-2 program. Meanwhile, Allied forces routinely exploited weaknesses in flight patterns to shoot down German rockets. Despite all the hype, Nazi jet engine technology was apparently too experimental to make a difference in the German war effort, which makes the post-war impression of the program seriously odd. Neville Chamberlain is notorious for his pre-war efforts to appease Hitler. In September 1938, political tensions along the Czech border were growing dire. Germans living in a region there known as the Sudetenland insist they were experiencing political violence, which gave Hitler easy justification for stationing German troops there. Chamberlain went to meet with Hitler in an attempt to broker an agreement that would prevent war, and in doing so, Chamberlain, working with other European leaders, actually offered up the Sudetenland to Germany if Hitler would give his word that the land grab would stop there. Hitler agreed, presumably with his fingers crossed behind his back, since Germany invaded Czechoslovakia and then Poland in 1939. But does Chamberlain's resulting bad rep actually make sense? Well, yes. In hindsight, working so closely with Hitler is a very, very bad look, not to mention believing anything he said and agreeing to give away a country that wasn't under the umbrella of the British Empire. But during the 1930s, the public wasn't quite so allergic to appeasement as a tactic. Many still vividly remembered the horrors of World War I and were all for anything that would prevent another major global conflict. The majority of politicians more or less agreed, but not Churchill. He was actually unpopular at the time for his very public, very correct warnings about the danger posed by Hitler. While he wasn't perfect, Chamberlain also had to balance the demands of the British people, the urgings of the other world leaders, and the shadow of the two recent wars as he made British policy. On the other hand, he was very, very mistaken, and that's exactly why Churchill took over as Prime Minister in 1940. As far as Britain and much of the rest of the world was concerned, Germany's September 1939 invasion of Poland was the last straw. At the same time, Germany had entered into a non-aggression agreement with the Soviet Union, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, aka the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. The Soviets wanted to prevent war with Germany, at least long enough to build up their own defenses, and as a bonus, they acquired some more territory in Eastern Europe. For his part, Hitler signed the agreement to neutralize the Soviet threat while Germany got to work gobbling up most of Europe. This means the Soviets also invaded Poland in September 1939. The new Slovak nation did too. Bet you didn't know that. But while Britain took this as a sign that Nazi Germany was now a declared enemy, the Soviet Union would become one of the big three Allied powers. So why did Joseph Stalin get a pass for his invasion while Hitler became Britain's greatest enemy? From a pragmatic perspective, the USSR was simply too powerful an ally and formidable an enemy to ignore. It's not as if the Soviets were especially fond of Germany, especially after Hitler went ahead and snatched back eastern Poland in June 1941. So as much as Britain and the other allies had to embrace practical considerations and turn a blind eye to moral ones by teaming up with Stalin, the tenuous alliance stuck, at least for a while. In other words, Poland was a pawn and the Soviets were a queen. And England? Well, she was going after the king. In Nazi Germany, drug use was a criminal offense, and anyone using banned substances was othered and treated as an antisocial. At least that's what some of the history books say. But in reality, the Nazi regime had a confusing and complicated take on substance use. Part of the issue depended on the substance in question. In German society at the time, someone struggling with alcoholism might find themselves publicly ostracized and even severely punished. There was a point at which some alcoholics were subjected to forced sterilization, although that wasn't a blanket practice. But while using other sorts of drugs wasn't exactly smiled upon, officials were more likely to recognize that as a societal problem requiring treatment, not punishment. A 2016 paper published in Holocaust and Genocide Studies found that Germans who committed wartime atrocities were more likely to use alcohol. And despite the Nazis' performative commitment to the health of the German people, German soldiers were often encouraged to use amphetamines in order to reduce the time dedicated to wasteful activities like sleeping.
How boring is sleeping? It stops you working. We've got a new Germany to build.
The most notorious Nazi-sanctioned drug may be Pervitin. Over 35 million Pervitin tablets were issued to the frontline soldiers in 1940 alone. If you don't know what Pervitin is, well, simply it's meth. And you know what happens when you abuse meth. Meanwhile, Hitler himself was reportedly swimming in medications issued by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. The decidedly unscrupulous Morell regularly issued stimulants, depressants, and opiates to the Fuhrer, including a German version of oxycodone.
He got hormone injections from animals, pig liver extracts.
The Hugo Boss myth goes something like this. German clothing brand Hugo Boss designed SS uniforms, managed to survive the war, and slid into the world of high fashion seemingly without incident. But there is a fabric of truth to this story. Hugo Boss was an actual person who started out as a tailor and opened a small-scale clothing business in Germany after World War I. And in 1931, he really did sign a contract to make uniforms for the SS, while continuing to manufacture everyday clothes. Eventually, his company dropped the clothing business and dedicated itself solely to the production of Nazi uniforms. But Boss never actually designed SS uniforms. The source of the confusion may be at the modern Hugo Boss company itself. Boss died in 1948, leaving the business to his family, who transitioned the company to suit making in the 1960s. Somewhere along the lines, Boss's Nazi ties were nearly forgotten. So in 1997, when the story resurfaced, some company officials were genuinely surprised. That didn't include the Boss family, though. They absolutely knew their founder and ancestor was a Nazi Party member. In fact, a photo of Boss with Hitler was one of the family's prized possessions. In 1999, Hugo Boss, the company, faced legal proceedings concerning its use of forced labor during World War II. And in 2011, the corporation officially apologized for its Nazi past.
Winter comes early. This has always saved Russia.
One take on the failed German invasion of Russia is that Nazi forces were somehow unaware that Russia gets really cold and snowy in the wintertime. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa was officially ordered in December 1940 and launched the following summer.
Without warning, Hitler's forces invade the Soviet Union. It's the largest land invasion in history.
More than 3.5 million troops were sent to the Russian front, which was some 1,800 miles long. At first, the German invasion, which involved 3 army groups, North, Center, and South, seemed to be making progress. But soon, Army Group Center, bound for Moscow, seemed to experience major supply issues. They were redirected elsewhere when they were just 220 miles from Moscow, because Hitler had decided that resource-rich Ukraine might be a better target. In fact, they did take Kyiv, back when the Soviets called it Kiev, and delivered decisive blows against the Soviets, including the brutal siege of Leningrad, before returning to attack Moscow in October 1941.
Led by a deluded belief, Hitler took on a vast land and people in their own world of ice and grit.
At this point, things were getting chilly. But while researchers agree that frigid conditions were far from beneficial to the Germans, a case study of winter warfare in Russia published by the Combat Studies Institute found that cold weather hasn't historically been a decisive factor. Hitler failed in Russia for a complicated variety of reasons, including the notorious Rasputitsa season, in which pre-winter or post-winter rains turned dirt roads into nearly impassable seas of mud. This slowed Germans down considerably, exhausting troops, and the beauty of it was that since it could happen in September and April, the Germans were stuck before and after the harsh winter. The sheer size of the territory, along with fierce Soviet resistance, further compounded the failure. German Admiral Karl Dönitz built up a submarine force that was once a major threat to the Allies, but the specter of U-boats began to fade as the war continued. So why did this torpedo-firing, blockade-building force wither away? It was starved by a lack of funds and attention, which makes very little sense considering that the Allied nations were then allowed to dominate the war at sea. If Hitler ever admitted that inattention to naval strategy was biting Germany back and hard, it happened far too late. Hitler biographer Frank McDonough told the Society for Nautical Research Hitler wasn't a sailor for sure. McDonough argued that Hitler was so focused on making gains in Europe that he neglected the Navy, and that the plans that were in place were often impractical. McDonough said, "They had a plan. It was called the Z Plan, to build the 8 battleships by 1942 or whatever, but it was impossible. That's why they lost the Battle of Britain." Dönitz advocated for building more submarines and attacking merchant ships, but his subs never materialized. In the meantime, Allied forces came up with ways to strike back against German vessels, to the point where, toward the end of the war, German submariners had a 75% mortality rate. While it's hardly useful to Monday morning quarterback the Second World War, some things do seem pretty obvious in retrospect. Like, how did the Axis powers ever hope to win? Sure, if all you go on is what they said about themselves, their self-serving, mythologizing, and grandiose speeches, it may seem like they stood a good chance. But a clear-eyed look at the facts tells a far different story. It wasn't all bad news, at least not at first. At the beginning of the war, Germany and Japan had built a fearsome reputation as canny warmongers hungry for more territory. Germany was also busy militarizing in defiance of the weakly enforced post-World War I Treaty of Versailles.
Anyone with half a brain knew that the Treaty of Versailles was essentially the starting gun for the Second World War.
Add to that the fact that Europeans were wary of engaging in another world war so soon, and the Allies may have been underestimated. But when the Americans joined them, they brought with them healthier supply chains and a higher population, plus a go-getter attitude that was dead set on taking out the Axis. Let's not forget that when the Soviets were fully on the Allied side, that presented a wall of problems for the Nazi machine. A booming war effort meant that even relatively small nations like Britain built strong fighting forces and far-ranging transportation networks. Germany, Japan, and Italy never had the same sort of infrastructure that the combined Allied countries built. For example, there were never any active German aircraft carriers despite their attempts to build one. Meanwhile, the Allies already had a robust naval force that they only increased during the war. Would the Axis have won? Sure, absolutely. There's many examples in the past of a smaller supply chain defeating a larger one, but the longer the war went on and the more nations added to the efforts, the chances of victory greatly diminished. On the morning of December 7, 1941, hundreds of Japanese aircraft suddenly arrive in the airspace above the Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Honolulu, Hawaii. With a barrage of munitions, Japanese forces destroyed much of the U.S. fleet stationed there, including over 300 planes, 4 battleships, 2,335 U.S. service members, and 68 civilians.
Nobody imagined the Japanese would do such a thing. This was almost like science fiction.
The attack sprang out of a tangled network of long-simmering rivalry and resentment between the U.S. and Japan. Many sources point to the beginnings of the tensions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but things got real after 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria. Things got even realer when Japan straight up invaded China proper in 1937. The really real tensions hit in September 1940 when Japan entered into the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. By late 1941, Japan had effectively decided the US was in its way. Though the nation's plan was sound in theory, the attack on Pearl Harbor specifically is still difficult to understand. US forces were already considerable, thanks in part to a 1940 military draft that helped the armed services grow to almost 2.2 million members by December 1941. And though Japan's attack inflicted a massive amount of damage, they didn't achieve near total destruction of the fleet. You could make the case that of all the places Japan invaded in early December 1941, Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, modern-day Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong, Pearl Harbor attack was the least successful. Not only did they fail to destroy repair shops and essential fuel oil tanks, they also failed to destroy any aircraft carriers. Just like Yamamoto allegedly said, they awoke a sleeping giant.
The American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Japan took a big chance. They tried to end the war before it began, and spoiler, they didn't. Conspiracy theorists occasionally claim US officials knew of the Pearl Harbor attack well in advance, but deliberately failed to do anything to make the nation's entry into World War II an obvious necessity. This has been dismissed as an outright falsehood by legitimate historians who make it clear that President Franklin D. Roosevelt was painfully surprised by the Japanese assault. There is a grain of truth here, however. The US had long managed tense relations with Japan and knew of the other nation's increasingly aggressive stance, which was part of the motivation behind the selective training and service draft signed by FDR in September 1940. This was ostensibly the first US peacetime draft, but was clearly influenced by growing tensions with Japan and the fact that World War II had already begun in Europe. What's more, Japanese officials warned US military personnel on at least 3 occasions: October 16th, November 24th, and November 27th, 1941. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, co-commander of the base at Pearl Harbor, was directly cautioned by Japan to execute an appropriate defensive deployment, though no other details were given. But when someone tells you to defend yourself, you should probably take heed. Part of the problem is that the US didn't exactly know where they needed to take defensive deployment. As we mentioned before, turns out everywhere. Kimmel and other commanders did prepare somewhat, but this included closely grouping craft on airfields, which is a great way to get a group of aircraft destroyed rather quickly, and only partially increasing monitoring around the Hawaiian Islands. It doesn't appear that FDR or any officials in Washington were aware of Japan's true intentions until mere hours before the Pearl Harbor attack. So, did the US know? Kinda. But did the US really think that Japan would fly all the way to Hawaii? Likely not. When your nickname is the Desert Fox, you know you're pretty good at the game. Even Allied leaders admitted to having some respect for Erwin Rommel, with UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill claiming that the German commander was a formidable adversary. Cool nickname and Churchill praise aside, a more fitting moniker would have been the Desert Procrastinator. Robert Citino, senior historian for the National World War II Museum, puts a lot of the early praise on Rommel thanks in part to one Adolf Hitler.
Hitler really likes him. He's very, very close to Hitler, and Hitler admires him.
Yet, these tactics came with a less admirable side. According to Citino's estimation, Rommel may have been more enamored with the glamour of war than the nitty-gritty details of supply chains and logistics. As such, he didn't spend much time worrying about administrative duties. Yet, attention to all these boring bits is often what makes for true success in war, and it surely falls on a general to ensure that such things are addressed. If you're still not convinced, consider that Rommel never managed to seize control of the vital Suez Canal, or take a hard look at what may be his most significant failure, the inability to put a stop to the Allied invasion of Europe on D-Day. With such big fumbles on his resume, Rommel's enduring reputation makes little sense. Just to show how important the facade of greatness was to the Nazis, despite being part of the assassination attempt on Hitler in 1944, he was still given the choice of being exposed as a fraud or chewing on some cyanide. He decided to keep the Desert Fox nickname and hope no one figured out the truth. We did. By early 1942, many Americans were understandably on edge. There were a lot of folks expecting a mainland attack on the US. Sightings abounded along the west coast of Japanese forces in the sky and seas, with most dismissed as mistaken identities. There were a few real attacks. A Japanese submarine attack on an oil field near Santa Barbara took place on February 23, 1942, and the often forgotten bombing in Oregon a few months later. But the best remembered today is the one with the most clicky name, the Battle of Los Angeles. On the night of February 24th, military forces received instruction to prepare for an unconfirmed Japanese assault. In the first hours of February 25th, radar supposedly picked up signs of an invading force. LA went into a blackout.
No lights anywhere. Not a cigarette is allowed to be lit on the street for fear of giving away any type of location to a potential enemy.
Searchlights pierced the skies and troops began firing an estimated 1,400 anti-aircraft rounds at something. Yet nothing came down. Some claimed to spot Japanese planes or a massive balloon, while others saw only clouds and smoke. No one was directly injured, though some reported deadly heart attacks and car accidents, while shrapnel damaged homes. The most likely explanation is a false alarm, though the scope of the panic remains confusing. For a while at least, it must have seemed as if Germany had a nuclear weapons program on lock. By the late 1930s, German scientists had already conducted and publicized their experiments on nuclear fission, in which splitting atoms produced potentially immense and destructive power. As Nazi Germany formally entered into war and began taking territory across Europe, its scientists worked to refine their materials and more reliably produce enriched uranium for use in weapons. With the hindsight of history and the devastation first wrought on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by American nuclear bombs, it's clear that the Nazi nuclear program failed. But why? Germany once had serious advanced science at its fingertips, as evidenced by the US push to incorporate Nazi scientists and engineers into its own post-war programs via Operation Paperclip. Part of the explanation centers on the fact that refining uranium and developing weapons was massively complicated and time-consuming. The Nazi government, lulled by the successes of conventional weapons, may have neglected to fund the nuclear program until it was too late, or they may have been scared off by the expensive but only semi-successful V-2 rocket program. It didn't help that key German intellectuals like Albert Einstein fled Europe to avoid anti-Semitic persecution, and subsequently lent their help to the American Manhattan Project. So it turns out being cheap and being bigoted cost the Nazis the bomb. Good job, Nazis. From 1943 to 1945, an estimated 425,000 German POWs were sent to detention centers across the US. Many arrived in rural Texas, where extra land made it easier to establish camps. Texas was also selected because the 1929 Geneva Convention maintained that POWs should be sent somewhere with a climate similar to where they were captured. For a German soldier apprehended in North Africa, Texas was deemed Africa hot, so that matched up. The Geneva Convention also required that POWs and their guards live in similar quarters, meaning that conditions were decent for German prisoners, to the point where locals derisively called a few Texas camps the Fritz Ritz. Captured soldiers likewise weren't required to work, though some did so anyway to alleviate the boredom and earn a bit of money.
By doing work like this in the shoe shop, captives are able to buy cigarettes and other luxuries.
Conditions were so good that very few tried to escape, and those who did hardly appeared to fear much retaliation. After the war, some attempted to stay in the US and even occasionally succeeded in becoming American citizens. On February 19, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, ostensibly to keep American military zones safe from foreign infiltrators. What it really meant was that some 120,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, many of them citizens, even second and third generation citizens, were forcibly relocated to internment camps with little regard for their livelihoods, property, or civil rights. You probably knew about the US treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II, but knowing that they were treated worse than captured Nazis makes their situation all the worse. We have covered the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki extensively in another video, so feel free to watch that one after this for a bit more detail. And yes, we know this is a passionate subject. Just look at the comments on that other video. We're just going to try and lay out the facts for you here. The main question is, was it necessary to nuke Japan? Internally, military officials also claim that a land invasion would kill up to 1 million US service members and would claim even more Japanese lives. If Japan continued to resist and US plans for a land invasion went ahead in what the Allied forces called Operation Downfall, it's possible that an already resource-stressed Japan would have surrendered. Or it could have been that fierce Japanese resistance, like that seen from both combatants and civilians at Okinawa and Iwo Jima, would have spiraled into a bloody guerrilla war. You can make the case for either side. Advocates for the fierce Japanese resistance point out that it took 2 nukes for Japan to finally surrender. On the other side, there were some peace feelers thrown out there by some members of the Japanese government, but we need to point out that they all had Japan keeping their emperor in power. That was a position not tenable to Allied forces. Even if the nuclear strikes in Japan avoided all that at a terrible price, they served additional purposes. The Soviet Union, which was quickly emerging as a major rival to the US, now saw what America was capable of doing, as did any leader sympathetic to Soviet communism. One of the questions today, therefore, is, did the US nuke Japan to send a message to the Soviets or to truly end the war?